How many discounts does USAA Auto Insurance offer? Too many to say here. Multi-vehicle discount, safe driver discount, new vehicle discount, storage discount, legacy.
How many discounts will you stack up? Visit USAA.com/auto discounts. Restrictions apply.
Finding a new job is stressful. But with Indeed, it doesn't have to be. Just fill out your Indeed profile with your skills, experience, and desired salary. The more you fill out, the better your matches will be. And hearing from hiring managers will be 2 times more likely. Relax. That's your Indeed profile sending opportunities your way. Indeed, the world can work better.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am so happy to welcome back to the show once again, Tony Riches. Welcome back, Tony.
Well, thank you for inviting me again. It's great. It's becoming a regular thing, this.
Well, you write a lot of books, so I am happy to welcome you back every time.
One a year. I write one a year. So it's a bit scary. It shows how the years are passing, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. Well, let's not be reminded. They move too quickly already. I seem to recall one time when I was working on my fiction book, I think it was, that you told me that the best way to do it was to write 1 page per day. And then you end up with 365 pages, right?
That's absolutely right. And it doesn't matter if you're not in the mood even, because as long as you write something, you can always edit something, but you can't edit a blank page, is what they say, isn't it? So if you're not happy with it, it's a lot easier to improve something once you've got it down on the page, you know?
That's so true. It really is. Well, it's amazing how many books that you have written over your career. I think I can call you a prolific writer.
Thank you. Well, I've done the whole of the Tudor dynasty now, so that's quite interesting, isn't it?
It is.
Starting off with Owen's first meeting with Catherine of Valois, and ending up with the rather sad end of Elizabeth I. It was quite tragic, propped up on cushions, because she'd been told that if she went to sleep, she might die or never wake up. So she decided, perfect solution, just don't ever go to sleep. It's a bit of a snag with that, though.
Doesn't always quite work out. People
like Robert Cecil and everybody are around her saying, I'm going to ask you who the successor should be. No answer means you agree with whatever I have in my mind.
That's one way to do it.
For it. That's not the last words you want to hear, is it?
No, definitely not. Well, today we're talking about a different Elizabeth, aren't we? We're going to talk about Bess Throckmorton, who I have always found as an extremely fascinating woman.
Absolutely.
Even if we go back to her parents and who her father was, in my mind, he is equally as interesting. Why don't we start out there and talk about her background, who her parents were?
I wrote a guest post last week, actually, about how Bess is somehow associated with just about every conspiracy from obviously the Throckmorton plot. It's from a Catholic background, powerful Catholic family, and they had branches everywhere, as they say, and roots everywhere, right through to the gunpowder plot. So you would think, well, how is she related to the gunpowder plot? But nearly all of the conspirators, except for perhaps Guy Fawkes, are actually distant cousins. And so, if it wasn't bad enough to have been involved in all the other plots, and that was really the icing on the cake, I think. Mm-hmm. But she spent the whole of her life struggling with the reputation of her family, the Throckmortons, because, of course, they were champions to the Catholic cause and then vilified by the Protestants and Puritans. So basically, poor Bess was kind of a bit labelled really as at the very least, a question mark, if not an actual high risk. And I think it worked to her advantage because Elizabeth always believed in keep your enemies close. And it's said that Bess's brother Arthur paid for Bess to become a lady in waiting to Elizabeth, because you could do that. You could just pay money and they would take the money quite happily. They had so many ladies in waiting that they didn't really mind one extra. And in really over a couple of years, she became a gentlewoman of the bedchamber. Now that is a huge privilege, because that is the daily first thing in the morning chatting with the Queen, and that's the sort of position where you get to ask a few favors if you choose to, and so everybody knows that and is trying to get her to mention them in dispatches, sort of thing. And a big position of trust as well, because obviously Elizabeth would only keep close to her, really, the people that she trusted implicitly. And then along comes this rascal Walter Raleigh, and I enjoyed writing about him, but I drew a line across after the death of Elizabeth in the book about him, because there really wasn't room to cover the rest of his life, writing a history of the world and things like that. But it picked up nicely then in Bess, because she did spend a lot of her time in the Tower of London with poor old Walter. And that must have been fascinating, because my wife and I, we went back to have you been to the Tower of London, they call it the Bloody Tower now, but it was called the Garden Tower in those days. Have you been there?
No, I was unable to get there on my trip last June, but when I go, I think this September I will.
What I recommend is, because there's this whole thing about the princes in the tower anyway, in that tower, but it's called the Bloody Tower since after Walter's time. In his time, it was called the Garden Tower. And outside, there's a little tiny herb garden, which represents the garden that Walter and Bess had. They made a home out of this place. But what you can do is you can sit in his cell and you can go up the stone steps to their bedchamber, well, the room that was used as their bedchamber, and get a real sense of what it must have been like to spend over a decade in there, And Walter basically he accustomed himself to it, and that was his life. He used to do his writing and have lots of visitors. And Bess got a little flat just round the corner, so she didn't have to actually sleep in the tower if she didn't want to. So she could pop home for tea and then come back and visit later on. So the yeomen of the guard were perfectly used to Bess coming and going as she pleased, which is nice, isn't it? But she was fiercely loyal to Walter, and I think we have to admire her for that, because he must have been so difficult to live with, given all of that, And I found that all very intriguing, really.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what it must have been like for her just to live through the reign of Elizabeth I.
The amazing thing is to actually marry Walter in secret, knowing that the Queen would be furious. That's not a great way of going about things, is it? But of course, it was catch-22. That if they asked permission and then she refused, which she had been known to do, then it would be double jeopardy, wouldn't it? To marry despite her explicit refusal. Yeah. So it was all decided for them when Bess fell pregnant. I can't imagine how that happened, and because they weren't even married. But the dilemma then is, what do you do? She continued going to court, and luckily the fashion of the day meant that she could get away with it for a surprisingly long time. They just thought she was putting on a bit of weight, perhaps, and obviously it reached a point when they couldn't keep it going any further. So they dreamt up this idea of her brother's wife being ill and needed her to nurse her in her illness. And so that got her excused from court at the vital time, But I enjoyed living through all of that. And of course, I've been living with Bess since I wrote Walter. So that's, 5 years.
Wow.
For 5 years, she's been haunting me in a nice way, I mean. And so I've studied all of her letters and read everything I could about her, as you can imagine. And I really wanted this book to really give you a sense of the person, and how they thought and how they felt about things, rather than just with, for example, the book on Drake. I had so many exciting sea voyages and things that I never really sort of slowed the pace, But with Bess, she sits there one time and she is a little bit bored because Walter's not around, and she's looking at her change and she realizes that one of her shillings has been clipped. But then she remembers that the penalty for clipping coinage is, for men, execution, and for women, burning at the stake. Yikes. So that's a bit of Hobson's choice, isn't it? And the fact, her defense that she must have been slipped in her change from the marketplace is not really, doesn't really count for anything, because it's considered a treason against the king. So this was King James, of course, then. And so that's the kind of details I like to find, because that's her daily life, Imagine if you look down at the coins in your hand. We don't have coins anymore in this country, I don't think. It's all in the sort of Apple Wallet. But if you did have coins and then you found one had been clipped, and it could mean that you got burned at the stake for being in possession of it. Those are interesting times, aren't they?
Well, yeah, it seems like your enemies could plant some of these coins
Definitely. On you. But there's one redeeming thing about being burnt at the stake in Elizabethan times, is if you asked very nicely, they would hang a bag of gunpowder around your neck so that you didn't suffer too much.
Yeah, that's nice, at least. Well, I want to go back a little bit and talk about that first pregnancy when she left court, and she had a son. What happened after she gave birth?
I was so sad because having risked everything, obviously somebody told the Queen, because Walter had a knack for making enemies. So it wasn't anything really against Bess, except they didn't see her as a victim. They saw her as perhaps even a temptress, or at least a little bit wanton. But once the Queen found out, it was quite simple, that she just had them both thrown in the Tower. So she didn't know what had happened to her child. And her child was basically taken into care. And her brother Arthur paid a woman to look after the child. And sadly, spoiler alert for those who haven't read the book, the plague was sweeping through London like waves, so everybody would think it was safe to go out again, and then they'd start dying of the plague all over the place, and then it would be okay again, and half the population had died or left, and then there'd be another wave of plague. And it was very indiscriminate. It took the rich and the poor, old and young, and it actually took the little child and his nursemaid, suspected to have died, because there's no record of their graves or anything like that. And of course, what used to happen, everybody would just end up in a plague pit, and that's tragic. But she was in the Tower at the time, and not in a good place at all, either physically or mentally. No privileges, in disgrace, no idea what would become of her. And her brother visits her and tells her that I'm doing my best for you to get you out. And she asks for a pen and paper, pen and ink, because she's denied everything. She's not even got a book. And the interesting thing that I found particularly fascinating was that she was only educated in those things which they deemed necessary for a lady to run a household. So that's a fairly short list of stuff. And so she could read and write, but only phonetically. And she didn't let that stop her at all. She wrote promptly to one of the most powerful men in the land, Robert Cecil, demanding all sorts of things, and phonetically, you know what I mean, and thought that was perfectly normal sort of thing to do. And she found out afterwards that Walter had been released for a while and hadn't even visited. So, so that's not great, is it?
No.
He was released because they captured a treasure ship, and the Queen was worried that the stuff was all getting looted from it before she could get her share. And Walter was ideally placed. He was available and he knew about all this kind of thing. And they gave him the job of writing an inventory of all of the contents of the ship and checking that nothing was missing from that. But it would have been a nice gesture to have visited his wife, or at least to send her some kind of token, you know?
Wow.
Perhaps a valuable ruby wrapped in a piece of paper or something like that. But...
something, anything. Like, it makes me just feel so bad for her, because it sounds like she would have done anything for him.
Absolutely. But even then, despite all of that, she forgave him and remained faithful and loyal. And I think you have to admire her for that, because having committed to him, she was truly committed. Yeah. And I quite like that, because some of the people I've written about, one that springs to mind is Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. I think we've spoken about him. He was the opposite. He was awful, really. If some woman smiled at him, he was away with her round the corner 5 minutes later, you know. And poor wives, Frances, she despaired of him, quite honestly, I think, because there was no changing him, you know. And the nice thing about Bess was she was completely opposite, and not just because of her faith. Some people, it was their faith that kept them very devout and loyal to their partners, you know. But in her case, I think there is a good, strong argument to say that she loved Walter and would stand by him right until the end.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to know, who were the people that she had in her inner circle when he wasn't around? Did she have certain women friends?
Well, that's the interesting thing about the Elizabethan series, is that I love the crossovers between the characters. So originally it was going to be about three of Elizabeth's favourite men, and I was obviously thinking of a couple of very prominent candidates, but I chose Drake, Essex, and Raleigh because each of them had a very different view of the Queen. You know, Drake worshipped her as Gloriana, and Essex saw her like his mum, really. He was like a son that she never had. And then Raleigh was the captain of her guard, and so he was an employee, really, you know. So each of them had a different view of her, which was fun to work around. And then the three ladies, I had so many to choose from, and it kind of emerged naturally as I was writing about the three men, because the first one, Penelope, is Robert Devereux's sister, and I was intrigued by her because she's a very modern woman, and you know, even today would not stand out. If she was able to do time travel, she would blend in nicely in present society, I think, because she didn't care about that she was married to a Puritan who didn't like dances or fine clothes or anything. She decided she was just going to go and do what she wanted to do, you know, and didn't really care who knew. So she would turn up at society parties. and not care really about it. And then Frances, of course, was his wife, and she was married to Philip Sidney, who was actually Penelope's lover, you see. So that's all very, we're almost getting into soap opera territory here, aren't we? Except it's all true. And poor Philip Sidney died unnecessarily on the battlefield, leaving Frances destitute. And of course, her father was the Queen's spy master, you see. So she was extremely well connected, and she became a countess a couple of times. So that whole story was intriguing. And then Bess, of course, as I've said, as I was writing about Walter, I became more and more fascinated. I was more fascinated by Bess than I was by Walter in the end, because most of what I learned at school about Walter turned out to be wrong. So if you ask anybody to give you 3 facts about Walter Raleigh, it's that he invented tobacco and the potato and laid down his cloak for the Queen. None of that stacks up at all. Sailors were smoking tobacco long before Walter popularized it, and potatoes have been around for millennia. It's just that he had plantations in Ireland and knew about potatoes and wanted to see how well they would do. So that's a whole nother story, isn't it?
Yes.
In Ireland, who would have thought, you know? But so Bess then was a brilliant way of ending an inspired way of ending the Elizabethan series, because she brings it all together nicely. And your question was, who did she surround herself with? She was very close to Frances, you see. So that connection meant that she was then linked into the whole of that sort of nobility network. Because we have to remember that although Bess came from a good family, it was a Catholic family, and they'd been several times over disgraced and fined everything they had, you know. So she came from a good family, but wasn't nobility, wasn't a noble. And of course, neither was Walter, although he liked to give the impression he got a knighthood, but he wasn't from a noble family. And he's from a family of Devon seafarers, really. So, I mean, that's not a bad thing, but it's interesting to see that we've got the kind of emergence for the closest you can identify as a sort of middle class coming through there, along with the merchant class. So, and there very much was a class hierarchy there. So even penniless nobles, like Robert Devereux, who was constantly in debt, acted as if they were millionaires, you know, and got away with it. Whereas poor Bess is counting every penny, literally, and jolly grateful when things go a bit better for her.
Yeah, I want to talk about what her life looked like after she lost favor with Queen Elizabeth.
Oh dear, yeah. Well, a strange thing happened was that you would have expected Elizabeth to make sure that they lived in poverty for the rest of their lives, but Walter he was quite a charmer, of course, and charmed his way back into royal favour, and then somehow managed to get granted an estate in Dorset, which belonged to the bishops. And basically, this was Sherborne Castle, which was a derelict castle, pretty much in the middle of Dorset. But the reason he was interested in it was if you travel from London to Cornwall, he was in charge of the stannaries in Cornwall, the tin mines in Cornwall, and that brought a lot of revenue in for the crown. And Sherborne is exactly on the route, so it's a perfect stopping off point. So he must have said, he picked his moment, can I have that ruined old castle? It's only in a couple of fields, you know, there's not much there really of any value. And she said yes. So he took Bess there. She was jolly glad to get out of London with all the plagues and everything. And there was a lodge there, a hunting lodge in the grounds, which was also derelict. And the only explanation I can think of is, do you remember I said that he had the job of making an inventory of all the treasure on the ship, right?
Yeah.
Suddenly he's very wealthy. Isn't that funny? With no obvious reason, certainly not from his salary as captain of the guard, I don't think. So, and I don't think it's from bribes or anything like that. This is enough to completely rebuild an Elizabethan manor house from what was Sherborne Lodge. And Bess is the happiest time of her life. So she went from being at the lowest ebb you possibly could to being really the lady of the manor, if you like. And that is, we have to remember, that's what she was raised and educated to do. So she was really in a comfortable place, you know, and she could recruit as many staff as she wanted. And she started breeding horses and was very successful at it. So she had a very successful stud there. And, you know, the big Shire horses that used to pull the ploughs and things like that.
Yeah.
They were worth an awful lot of money, and they were breeding those at Sherborne. And as part of my research, I went to visit Sherborne, which is still there, by the way. I recommend, if you're ever in Dorset, it's worth a visit. And I was lucky because I was a bit cheeky. I emailed the owner of it, who is Lady Maria Winfield Digby. Her family acquired Sherborne from the Raleighs after Walter's death, and they're still there. They're still running it. And Maria agreed to give me a personal guided tour of Sherborne, which is fantastic. I mean, you can't hope for better than that. And we went up to Walter's study, which the public aren't usually allowed in. And she said the reason that they're not allowed here is the stairs are rather dangerous. That's not what you want to hear when you're up on the top floor, is it? But I was able then to visit the rooms that Bess would have used, and they called it her closet. It was like her little room where she would do her accounting and her tapestries and sewing and things like that, remaking clothes, because that's all the things that she was trained to do, you see. And when you look out the window, there's lovely views across the deer park. And I realized then that view has hardly changed since their time, because it wouldn't have. That's what it would have looked like, very similar to that.
That is my favorite thing about history, Tony, is going to these places that are unchanged, or standing inside of these historic buildings and looking out a window, imagining these historic figures doing the same thing. I just love that.
There's a display in Sherborne and of things that belong to Walter and Bess, and one of them that intrigued me was Walter's pipe, his tobacco pipe. And I hope I didn't overdo it, but it's a little thing in the book. He would tend to light up his pipe and puff away at it, right? And Bess hated the smell of tobacco. But you can imagine in a small cell in the Tower of London, and there's somebody smoking a pipe, and it would soon fill up with smoke, wouldn't it? And everything would smell of tobacco and smoke. But never did she really say to him, for God's sake, just leave the pipe for today, just while I'm here. You can smoke it after I've gone. And I had that as a little kind of motif that recurs in the book, is that particularly when he's trying to think of what to do next, he'll light up his pipe and have a few puffs,
As one does.
That is exactly what would have happened, because he popularized smoking. And that went well, didn't it? That worked out well.
I was going to say, that worked out real well.
The worst thing was King James wrote a proclamation about the dangers of smoking. So there's a man ahead of his time, isn't it?
Yeah, but quite ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So if only they'd listened more to him, and said, he's got a point there. I think I should stub this out and leave the pipe in my pocket. But it took a few years. These days, I don't know what it's like with you, but it's very rare to see somebody smoking. I don't very often, certainly not on television. It really catches your attention if somebody lights up a cigarette on any television program.
It really does. Yeah. I don't know if maybe it's still pretty common in some places in the US, but the cost of buying cigarettes has gone through the roof. So I think in a way that has deterred some people from smoking.
Well, I was behind somebody in a queue very briefly, but it's just kind of relevant because it links back to Bess, was that somebody bought a couple of packets of cigarettes and it was £30, which I don't know what that is in dollars. It's somewhere around $30, isn't it? I mean, it's $25 for a couple of packets of cigarettes.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it's definitely, I think here now, the other day I saw in the store, it was like $12 per pack. And I used to be a smoker, but I haven't smoked in about 14 years. And back when I smoked, they were $2 per pack.
Oh, wow.
That's quite a difference.
But it's interesting because, if we're going to credit Walter with popularizing smoking, there are global consequences that stem from that. And Bess could have said to him, I don't think this is good for you. You're not doing well on all this, because it's neat tobacco, not filtered or anything,
Yeah.
And he used to grow it himself. That's why it's called the garden tower, was he grew tobacco plants in the garden because he couldn't afford to have expensive tobacco. And he used to dry it over the fire, dry the leaves, so he had them hanging up like a washing line over the fire. And that would have smelled a bit horrible as well, I think.
I can't even imagine. She really does sound like she was like the dutiful wife, right? She was there for him when he needed her. When James the First came to the throne, now I'm going to make sure, see if I get my timeline right here, because this is the part of Tudor history I don't know as well.
I didn't either, by the way. Because we kind of skipped straight to the Civil War when I was in school. That's my memory. Perhaps I nodded off.
Well,
Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Civil War.
That's it.
First World War.
Just jump through time. Well, when James the First came to the throne, was Walter already in the tower, or was he placed in the tower after?
He was released on condition, and he was planning a voyage to search for El Dorado, the city of gold. So James had half an eye on, that'd be quite handy if he found the city of gold, because I could claim it all for the crown. Yeah. So that would be good. But of course, Walter being Walter, he upset them again because the king's what shall I call him? Favorite companion, gentleman, was given Sherborne. So that Walter took that badly, you see. He thought it was for all the wrong reasons. And but anyway, so the answer to your question is that Walter should have made jolly sure he kept in with King James, because he could have benefited hugely from it and become the Admiral of the Royal Navy and all that sort of thing. But instead of that, he started upsetting people and ended up locked up again. So that wasn't great for Bess.
No. Well, if James gave away their home, where did Bess go?
Oh, she had a real hard time then. So basically, there was a lot of rented accommodation in London, but not in the best areas. And, we have to think about the hygiene. They used to throw the slops out of the window into the street. That's not just a thing from Hollywood. That used to really happen. And then it would run down into the Thames, and there were plagues of rats as well. And of course, all sorts of bed bugs and fleas and things like that. So I made sure there's a bit of a mention of those. And that she was really struggling. So she decided to put on her best dress and go and appeal to King James, because she still had access to court. She knew how to blag her way past the guards and things like that. She would just say, "Do you know who I am?" or something like that, and they would just let her through. She got access to the king, but only briefly, and he was just a bit bewildered by this woman who was asking him favors and offering nothing much in return. If Walter had actually found El Dorado, it would have been a very different story, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But sadly, a couple of his men got eaten by a giant lizard halfway up the river, and in the end, they ran out of supplies and had to come home again. So,
A giant lizard. So was that like an alligator?
yeah.
Okay.
But they didn't know about alligators then. They just, all they knew was this giant lizard rose up out of the. It'd be quite shocking, wouldn't it, to be trying to find the city of gold quite innocently, to loot it from the local people, and then giant lizards start attacking you.
I can't even imagine, like, we have such full access, right, with the internet to be able to know all of these things that we might not see every day. But during their lifetime, these things were like alien to them.
Absolutely. But exciting as well, because there was potentially, you could become a millionaire. You know, you could establish America, couldn't you?
Yes, you could
sail across and set up Virginia and name it in honor of the Queen, and things like that, which is quite hard to do these days, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say quite hard.
I claim this land in the name of King Charles III. It's not got quite the same ring. I could call it Charlestown, couldn't I?
Oh, you could. Yeah. Well,
no, seriously, what happened was Bess was a resourceful survivor. So I don't want to give too much away, because I would like some people to be able to read the book without knowing everything. But she lived to the age of 82. So she is one of the last true Elizabethans, in that she literally saw Elizabeth every morning, every night, tucked her into bed, and shared secrets with her. So she really was close to the Queen at her peak, in her prime. And she witnessed everybody that she knew died of one way or another. And so she saw the introduction of the Stuart regime, with all that went with that. And she ended up in quite a nice house, well looked after, and her son looked after her as well. So she was, there's kind of as close as you can get to a happy ending in it, because 82 for an Elizabethan is quite a respectable age, really.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, now you mentioned another son, which we didn't even talk about, that they did have another child.
I'm trying to walk a tightrope of not giving away everything.
Okay, that's okay. We don't have to talk about him, because I definitely want to talk about, and spoiler alert for those who don't know, Walter Raleigh was executed. Let's talk about the story that has been going around forever, whether or not it's true that she carried his head around with her for the rest of her life.
Yeah, I've got a rule that I only put stuff in my books, historical details, that I can validate from a reliable source. And I personally couldn't find a reliable source other than a contemporary note of the execution, which said that Walter's head was taken away by a group of ladies. So it's perfectly reasonable that that group of ladies could have either been associates of Bess or included Bess. But that's not the same as then the jump to her carrying it around in a silk bag for the rest of time, is it? There are certain practical issues with that. You know, she could get thrown out of the theatre, couldn't she, if they searched her bag? Or what? No, I shouldn't joke about it. It's a bit grisly, but in the searching for evidence, I found several rather nice-looking red silk bags which claimed to be the former property of Bess Raleigh. But there's more than one of them for a start. And actually the records refer to a leather bag. So the whole idea of it being, I suppose that would eventually get replaced by a nicer one. But sadly, like a lot of these things, I think there's a bit of truth in it, in that these myths and stories don't come from nowhere, but they get a bit embellished in the retelling. And I think that it's fair to believe that eventually Bess's mystery son, that we haven't talked about, made sure that Walter's head made it back to join his body, to join the rest of him. So that would fit with the idea of her having possession of it as a kind of little souvenir, a keepsake, like you do. And so it's intriguing. I would have loved to have found something really verifiable so that I could put that in the book, but I didn't. But it doesn't really change the substance of the story, because she was present at his execution, which must be absolutely shocking, mustn't it, really, when you think about it?
I can't even imagine what these people went through. And so often as history enthusiasts, we wish we could go back in time, right, and live as these people did. But the way you've described it to me today, I would never, ever want to go back and live in London during this time. It just sounds so smelly and dirty and dangerous.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for this day.
Are your business expenses playing hide and seek? With Uber for Business, the small spends that slip through the cracks, like rides and meals, go right where you need them. Because it integrates with leading expense platforms, you can say goodbye to surprise costs, missing dollars, or chasing receipts. Everything's track downable. Uber for Business. Make small steps that make a big impact. Learn more at uber.com/small steps.
It depends who you are, because if you went back and you found that you were Queen Elizabeth first, that'd be quite fun, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, that might be better.
But you might be Anne Askew.
Yeah, I wouldn't want that.
Not so good.
Not so good.
You just say whatever you want to know. I'll just tell you.
Yeah, right. Yes. Catherine Parr did that. Yes, she did. I'll give you all the names. Well, I'm curious, Tony, because you've written about all of the Tudors, starting with Owen, and over the years writing about them and researching them. What kind of changes did you see in society as a whole through this time period?
It's kind of incremental, because there's a real danger of compartmentalizing history into neat little sections, the Tudors and the Stuarts. But of course, there was an overlap, and people like Bess were bridging that overlap. So they grew up as Elizabethan Tudors and then became subjects of the Stuart regime. But I think that the most intriguing sort of side is this shift where you had almost feudal lords, like lords of the manor, had almost like slave labor workforce, didn't they? So it was the feudal system. And then that slowly, very slowly over generations migrates into an emerging merchant class, which is very global. So Venetians and Portuguese and French merchants. So all of that was quite fascinating to slowly work my way through. And then, of course, the ambassadorial class, so that at one time, there were always ambassadors, weren't there? But they were not explicit. They didn't call themselves the ambassador of Spain or something. But then gradually that became a very respected thing to be. So if you were a visiting ambassador, Elizabeth I would throw a banquet and not care at all about the expense, out of respect for your role. And that whole idea under, for example, Henry VII, he used to basically take care of business himself, as far as I could tell, generally, whereas even Henry VIII had a lot more ambassadors. And there's that painting, isn't there, the ambassadors, which like marks a turning point in the status of those sort of, normally men. They were all men, weren't they, really?
Yeah, they were.
There were women that worked in an ambassadorial role, but that was quite different, I think.
Yeah. I love that you've covered the whole of the Tudor period in your books. And I want to make sure that people who are unfamiliar with your work, and at this point, I don't know how they would be, but for those who are unfamiliar.
Where have they been?
Right? Maybe they've been under a Stuart rock for a while and we're pulling them out. But for those who are unfamiliar with your work, where can they find your books, Tony?
Just go into Amazon and type in Tony Riches and they'll all pop up. I've got a website, which is tonyriches.com, and all my books are on there, and they are all available as ebooks, paperbacks, and audiobooks. And I'd kind of, the narrator of my audiobook of Essex had COVID or something, so there was a massive delay on that. But the guy that took over from him put sound effects on. So he also did Raleigh. And so when Raleigh's in a tavern, you can hear tavern noises. And when a cannon fires, as a real cannon goes off. I just found that fascinating, I love it. All the books that are about ladies in the Elizabethan series are narrated by an actress called Ruth Redman, who's got a very comforting voice. But what she does, the reason I can't do it, by the way, is if I try and do a lady's voice, it sounds ridiculous. But she can do a man's voice really nicely because she just puts slightly different emphasis on different. You're not even aware of it. It's only when I started thinking about it. But I do find it absolutely amazing to spend a year writing a book, and then one day an email pops through with a sample of the audiobook, and I actually hear somebody like Bess talking to me in a very compelling way, and makes you really sit back and think, God, did I do that? I'm still waiting for the call from Netflix, by the way, because I just think it would be a great. We start off with the Tudor trilogy, make it a 12-parter, But I got some great ideas for all the people I'd actually cast in it, so that would make it easy for them, wouldn't it?
I love it. Anybody who's listening, we need to start bombarding Netflix with Tony Riches.
Well, the thing is, I have to be so careful that I don't name any names, but quite a lot of Tudor dramas have been a bit casual about the history, haven't they?
Yes.
And that really bothers me. It shouldn't, because best of luck to them, they know what they're doing. But to merge, for example, Mary Tudor and her sister Margaret is a crime as far as I'm concerned. They may have saved money on one actor or something, but what about the people that are trying to understand Tudor history, Where does that leave them?
Exactly.
Confused, I think.
Yes, I think so too. And that's what we're constantly combating, is the people who watch that series and take it as 100% fact. And
yeah.
It's not. Well, and I love your series. You've done such a great job researching this. And if you're listening or watching right now, I highly recommend that you go out and get Tony's books today. Tony, thank you so much for coming back on the show again.
It's been great to speak to you again. I don't know if you'll have to change your branding so you can talk about the Stuarts, but that's where I'm heading next.
Yes.
Post-Tudor, I could call them, couldn't I?
You could. Hey, I already changed my branding to Tudor's Dynasty and Beyond. So you fit right in there.
That's good.
Yeah, so we will have you back.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tony. And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.